Back from the food. Great conversations. The Storm Safe and Climate Change Ready session will provide two presentations followed by Q&A on building resilience to coastal hazards and climate change in Hawaii and creating a resilience strategy for Oahu. I'm your moderator, Bob Stanfield. I work for the City Department of Planning and Permitting as the Chief of Development Plans and Zone Change Branch, and I've been involved in major projects for the department, including the revision of the EVA Development Plan, Central Oahu Communities Plan, the PUC Development Plan, and the East Honolulu Sustainable Community Plan. And until recently, I supported the Director and Deputy Director in representing the city in state processes concerned with adaptation to the impacts of climate change. Our first speaker is going to be Dr. Chip Fletcher. He's the Associate Dean for Academic Affairs and Professor of Geology and Geophysics at the School of Ocean and Earth Science and Technology at University of Hawaii at Manoa. He has over 100 peer-reviewed articles to his record, as well as 3 textbooks. He's currently leading a team that's preparing projections and mappings of Hawaii coastal flooding, inundation, and erosion due to sea level rise, which will be incorporated in the state's Interagency Climate Adaptation Committee report to the 2018 legislature. The report's on sea level rise, vulnerability, and adaptation. Following him will be Dr. Bradley Romine, a coastal geologist and coastal management specialist with the University of Hawaii Sea Grant College and the Hawaii Department of Land and Natural Resources. Dr. Romine's a Sea Grant Extension faculty. He's currently supporting the development of a statewide sea level rise, vulnerability, and adaptation report through his work with DLNR. He's also leading the development of science-based planning tools and guidance for improved resilience to coastal hazards. He's also involved with the NOAA grant to support resilience planning and climate adaptation in Hawaii. Our final speaker will be Josh Stanbro, who was recently selected as Honolulu's first Chief Resilience Officer. He also serves as the Executive Director of the new Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency, created by a November 2016 charter amendment. He's leading city resilience building efforts to help Oahu prepare for, withstand, and bounce back from the shocks, catastrophic events like hurricanes, fires, and floods, and the stresses, slow-moving disasters like water shortages, homelessness, and unemployment. And with that, our first speaker, Dr. Fletcher.
Thank you, Bob. I don't have much to say about this opening slide, but I think as sea level rises, we see signs all around us, and it's worthwhile paying attention to these signs. That's a monk seal that's pulled up onto a little patch of sand where the beach wants to be, but instead we have a highway in the way, Ho'opililani Highway. So sea level rise, global sea level rise results from 3 factors: thermal expansion of the ocean, melting of the mountain glaciers of the world, and melting of Greenland and Antarctica. The global rate of sea level rise now has more than tripled over the past century, so we know that there is acceleration in global sea level rise occurring. And here in the Pacific, it's characterized by high degrees of variability. The red colors indicate rates of sea level rise over 1 meter per century, and this is over the period 1993 to 2011. And yet things switched just before the El Nino of 2015, and now we have rates of sea level fall in the West Pacific and very dramatic rates of sea level rise in the Eastern Pacific. So the Pacific is characterized by high degrees of variability, and a lot of this variability is related to the El Nino southern oscillation and some variability occurring on decadal scale. We've recently gone through extreme tides. We've seen now 3 months, each of which has broken the previous 110-year-long record of the Honolulu tide gauge. Part of the extreme tide phenomena is related to this bulge of warm water which surrounds Hawaii and which has been here for the better part of a year. We're not quite sure what that is, but it's the subject of research right now, and it has added to other factors which have given us record-setting high tides. Global sea level rise is dependent very strongly on the melting of ice, and we monitor the world's cryosphere using this gravity satellite, which weighs the world's ice and has been doing so for quite a while. You can see here in dark red the areas of Greenland which are melting, and we are now losing 280 some billion tons of ice per year since, I think that's 2003. You can see the long-term total mass of Greenland is strongly in decline, and the long-term total mass of Antarctica is also strongly in decline. And the West Antarctic ice sheet there in dark red has actually been declared as being unstoppably or irreversibly retreating. There's nothing we can do about it at this stage. The oceans today absorb heat at twice the rate they did 18 years ago, so they are taking up a lot of heat, and all this information has been incorporated in a new 2017 report from the National Oceanographic and Atmospheric Administration. In it, they propose 6 scenarios. Their intermediate scenario is about 1 meter by the end of the century. That used to be the extreme edge of the uncertainty envelope for the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change. 1 meter by the end of the century was the worst case scenario. It's now the intermediate scenario, taking into account the fact that all the ice is melting faster than we had anticipated. An intermediate high scenario and a high scenario get up to 5 and 6.5 feet. And if you're doing long-term planning, for instance, if you're building a nuclear power plant on the edge of a beach, you want to plan for the long term, and you need to use higher rates of sea level above 3 feet. This is a table that's in this NOAA report, and they go decade by decade to the end of the century, and the 6 scenarios are here. We'll focus on the intermediate high scenario in some modeling results that I'll show you. I want to point out that sea level does more than just come across the shoreline. It also comes up from underground. This is the water table that rises because it is connected to the ocean. We call this groundwater inundation. And sea level will also come out of our storm drain system and flood onto the roads. And you can see here sand that is deposited at the highest tide of the month, and a long rivulet of salt water that has run down the gutter here. This is water that is coming out of the storm drain. It's not rainwater that's going into the storm drain. It's an interesting question to ask, is this the new administrative shoreline? Because it indicates the highest reach of the wash of the waves. This is the water table excavated by the Board of Water Supply when they go to repair their underground utilities. It's only 2 feet below the ground level at high tide, and that 2 feet of dry soil is given to us through the dredging of the Alawai Canal, the dredging of Ala Moana Swim Basin, and dredging of Koala Basin, and other dredging that was done prior to World War II. That dredge spoil raised the land. Nonetheless, we do have a problem with drainage when there is rain at high tide. The seawater blocks the storm drains, and there's no place for this rainwater to go. Our groundwater modeling looks like this. In yellow is 1 foot of dry soil sitting above the water table. And so here we are with 1 foot of sea level rise, which on the NOAA scenario would put us about 2 decades from now. Here is 2 feet of sea level rise, 3 feet and 4 feet of sea level rise. We're not even out of the century yet, according to the long-term planning scenario of NOAA. We're just in the second half of the century. There's 5 feet. We also have a problem with seasonal waves. You know, in the summertime, the high waves arrive from the southern hemisphere on our south shores. And at 2 feet of sea level rise, which would be sometime near mid or early second half of the century, we get some run-up of typical summer swell into the Eva Beach community. But at 3 feet of sea level rise, you sort of pass this critical point, and we have dramatic flooding taking place every year. This is not storm flooding, it's not tsunami flooding, this is annual high swell. Of course, we're already encountering coastal erosion, and our typical response is to build a seawall. That means that eventually the beach will disappear. Seawalls also cause flanking down the coastline. On unarmored shorelines, we see accelerating erosion where there is not a seawall. And the problem with seawalls is that in a world of rising sea level, beaches want to migrate to stay at the edge of the ocean, and they can't if there's a wall there, so the beaches go extinct. This is important if you are a monk seal, if you are a turtle. It's actually federally recognized critical habitat. So we've modeled this problem of erosion. Today on Sunset Beach, and we have Sunset Point there on the bottom panel, and Ehukai Beach Park sort of up here. So this is a continuous line air photo. Today we have 18 buildings along the Sunset stretch, about 10% of the shoreline, which currently have seawalls. Now, with 1 foot of sea level rise, this jumps to 60% of the buildings wanting seawalls because they fall within the emergency permit guidelines. They fall within 20 feet of the active edge of the beach. And if we allow all of these buildings to build their seawalls, we can kiss Sunset Beach goodbye and all of its cultural value, its economic value, its ecologic value. We need to do something in terms of providing an exit strategy for these homeowners, to leave the edge of the ocean. There's Eva Beach, under 3 feet of sea level rise. We see our seasonal annual waves. That yellow line, it's hard for you to see, that's the 80 percentile probability of erosion. And in green is groundwater inundation. Basically, groundwater inundation is new wetlands. There's Waikiki. You can see a combination of flooding styles. The Alawai overflows its banks, plus over in western Waikiki, we have a very low-lying area. And you can sort of summarize this with what the Dutch have said, that if you wage war with water, you will lose. And so we need to yield and we need to elevate. That is, we need to get away from the shoreline and raise our civilization. Now, there is good news. The last 3 years, the amount of CO2 emissions worldwide have flatlined. After decades of rising CO2 emissions, the rate of CO2 increase in the atmosphere has gone to 0. It's still a lot of carbon dioxide, but it's gone to 0. If we can turn this and bend the curve down by 2020 and then cut our emissions by 50% every decade thereafter, we could stop warming at 1.5 to 2 degrees C worldwide by mid-century. And here's a movie that'll tell us about that. Well, we won't get to see the movie, despite promises to the contrary.
You want to just act it out?
Yeah, but I don't know if they... Okay, well, we'll just end with that. Thank you. Yes.
Somebody will leak it.
Maybe after all the talks, I can show it. It's only 3 minutes long. It's very inspirational.
Thank you, Chip. Just a housekeeping point. You were to be given 2 3x5 index cards. Those are for the purposes of questions. We have 2 folks from the UH, Trevor and Umio. Please hold your hand up. And they will be, if you need cards for additional cards, they will pick up your questions and bring them to the podium. And with that, we'll bring Dr. Romine to give his presentation.
Okay, thank you, Bob. Thanks, everybody, for being here and inviting me. Again, I'm Brad Romine with the University of Hawaii Sea Grant Program and work in the DLNR Office of Conservation and Coastal Lands on a cost share agreement position with them. My name there, I'm going to be talking about sea level rise vulnerability and adaptation report that's getting near completion here. I'm not an author on that, I just want to clarify that. But I have been, my capacity has been as a technical advisor and supporting the outreach for the sea level rise report. We've just completed our round of public informational and Q&A sessions around the state, visiting all the islands except for Lanai. Just wondering, by show of hands, how many of you were able to attend one of those agency or public informational meetings on your island? Okay, handful of you, okay. Well, good, then this won't all be repetition. I'm glad I've got some new information for you all here. I'm going to talk about the Sea Level Rise report, and then I'm going to talk about some additional work we're doing to build on this with a grant we got from NOAA. So this work is coming out of the Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation and Adaptation Initiative. This was passed this year, Act 32. It replaces, supersedes Act 83. They've added mitigation to the mix in addition to adaptation, being that this is a two-pronged approach. You can't just focus on adaptation. We got to focus on our greenhouse gas mitigation at the state level as well. With this act, Hawaii became the first state to enact legislation that implements portions of the Paris UN Climate Agreement. Through this act, it establishes a Hawaii Climate Change Mitigation Adaptation Commission. This is continuing the work of an interagency climate committee that had been meeting for the last 3 or 4 years. The membership is essentially the same, and that group is coming together for the first time in October of this year under the new commission. The commission is intended to provide policy direction, coordination, and planning among the agencies related to climate. It's also intended to establish climate change mitigation adaptation strategies, and the first task remains with this commission to develop the statewide sea level rise vulnerability and adaptation report. This report is due to the state legislature end of this year, nearing completion. With it, we're compiling the best science on climate change and sea level rise. We're projecting and modeling hazards exposure related to sea level rise. I'll show you some examples of that. We're assessing vulnerabilities to hazards related to sea level rise and making recommendations for improving resilience to hazards. And with the report, we also intend to provide a framework that can be used ideally for assessing other climate impacts. Sea level rise is not the only impact we expect from climate change, but it's the first one the state has chosen to address through this commission. We're stressing that this is a report on sea level rise, vulnerability, and adaptation. It's not an adaptation plan. This is really kind of the beginning of the conversation as we look at it. There's a lot of work to come following this. So first I'm going to talk a little bit briefly about sea level rise hazard modeling and mapping for the report. We're doing this working closely with Chip and his team at UH to provide 3 models for the hazard assessment. Those are passive flooding. Chip showed some examples of these. Passive flooding, where we're just looking at areas that are susceptible to static sea level rise at marine and backshore areas. We're looking at coastal erosion hazards, and we're looking at high wave overwash impacts. And these are being assessed at various intervals with focus primarily on 1 foot of sea level rise being our near-term scenario for the coming few decades, and over 3 feet of sea level rise, about 3 feet of sea level rise for the latter half of this century. For the purposes of the vulnerability assessment, those 3 model hazard areas are being combined into a sea level rise exposure area. That's adding together the passive flooding, annual high wave flooding, and coastal erosion, those aerial extents of those maps. And the reason behind that is that we consider these areas basically flooded, lost potentially, depending on, regardless of which process it is, whether it's erosion or wave overwash or just passive flooding. Show you some examples of the data that's coming out of this report and maps that will be within the report. This is Kihei, southwest Maui, with 1 foot of sea level rise, showing that sea level rise exposure area. Here's Kihei at 3 feet of sea level rise. And then Tetra Tech, the state's consultant, who's the lead author on the report, is taking the hazard modeling that's coming out of CHIP's group. They're combining it in this sea level rise exposure area, and then they are looking at potential vulnerabilities, including economic losses. And this is a map of potential economic loss for that same area of Kihei at 1 foot of sea level rise. They're conducting this at the property level scale using demographic data, TMK data, whatever they can collect from the states and the counties as far as GIS layers. These economic impacts are done at the property level scale. They're then aggregating them up to the hectare level. That's roughly 2.5 acres. You see these grid cells there. And the assessment is based on the lost land value, the potential lost land value, and the loss of the structure. It does not account for things like damage or loss to utilities or future business loss. It's just the existing home and land or building and land there. And here is Kihei at 3 feet of sea level rise, again, showing those losses. And just for reference, these grid squares, these hectare grid squares, the yellow is under $250,000 per grid cell, and the darker reds are 10 million to 50 million per hectare. So seeing some significant impacts with 3 feet of sea level rise in this area. Tetra Tech is then taking this data, compiling it at the island level and state level to provide summary results. And here's an example of draft results for the state. I should have mentioned earlier, saw it on the maps. This is all draft work. The report is in review right now with the Climate Commission, working to revise it and finish it up by the end of this year. But here's the draft results statewide for Hawaii. Top right is areas of land loss in the sea level rise exposure area. I know you can't read that. I'll just tell you that it shows the different islands from left to right. The peak one there is the island of Oahu. That's about 9,400 acres of area exposed to sea level rise at 3.2 feet. You can see that it's significantly more for Oahu. That's largely because of our topography. Our coastal topography is generally more low-lying. Lower in the graph is looking at economic losses. The middle left one is total economic loss due to structure and land loss. Again, that top, the highest one there is Oahu, $12.9 billion in potential damages and loss just to sea level rise exposure. The other plots look at things like number of residents displaced at 3 feet of sea level rise, numbers of structures flooded, and things like miles of road flooded. But the statewide total so far with this initial analysis is $19 billion worth of property and land exposed to damage and loss from sea level rise at 3 feet of sea level rise. The report is going to provide broad-scale recommendations on what to do for sea level rise. Again, this is a report, not a plan, but we're looking at what should be the key next steps in planning for adaptation. This is coming out of stakeholder input. We conducted statewide workshops on Oahu, but inviting folks from statewide, cross-section of people from private, public, community in 2016 and 2017. I think some of you in the room I can see attended those. But the recommendations will kind of cover the general categories of planning, policy, governance, design and construction, financing and incentives, natural and cultural resources, and emergency management. Shifting gears here, I'm going to talk about a project that we're doing that builds on the work from the Climate Adaptation Initiative and Sea Level Rise Report. This is our NOAA-funded project. It's a Sea Grant-led project called Building Resilience to Coastal Hazards and Climate Change in Hawaii. It's a partnership that builds off of the co-chairs of the Climate Commission, which are Sam Lemo at the DLNR and Leo Asuncion at the Office of Planning, who are co-eyes on our project as well. We have 3 complementary projects that I'm going to talk about, and the overall time frame for this project is out to April 2019. So this is a lead on, building on what's going on with the Sea Level Rise Report and the results in part. The first project we're doing is an online sea level rise map viewer. This is intended to be an online atlas for the Sea Level Rise Report. We're not going to be able to provide all the map data as an atlas with the Sea Level Rise Report, so this is the place that folks can go to view the data, ideally download it, zoom into their particular area of concern, look at more local hazard exposure and vulnerability results. And the goal, the hopes with this is that we can empower decision makers and communities to better understand and plan for increasing coastal and flooding and erosion with sea level rise. The second project we're doing with the NOAA funding is integrating resilience in community planning. The goal with that is to improve assessment of and planning for coastal hazards, climate change, and sea level rise, with a particular focus on the community and general planning process at the county level. We want to identify gaps and opportunities for integrating coastal resilience into these plans, build on the guidelines for, and begin to implement the recommendations from the Hawaii Sea Level Rise Report, as well as providing some recommendations and guidance on how to utilize this new data, this new map GIS data on sea level rise hazards into the community planning process. And then we also want to improve implementation of the Hawaii Climate Adaptation Priority Guidelines within the State Planning Act. The third and final project we're doing with this is titled Resilience-Focused Disaster Reconstruction Planning. This project is expanding on a recent project they did at Maui County and Sea Grant called Post-Disaster Reconstruction Guidelines and Protocols. We want to develop guidelines for increasing resilience to future hazards with a focus on protecting environmental resources through the post-disaster rebuilding process with a goal of building back safer, stronger, smarter, and faster after a damaging disaster. We really look to this as a way to address adaptation when there's a disaster, so we don't build back necessarily in exactly the same way, same vulnerable location and way. So thank you very much.
Now we're going to do a short Q&A section. Would Trevor and Umio please stand up? If you have questions that you'd like Dr. Fletcher, Dr. Romine to answer, please give them to our aides. I'll use the moderator's privilege of asking a couple of preliminary questions before I get the cards. Chip, we've had a number of conversations about when would these projections, these forecasts of flooding, erosion, be good enough for prime time, meaning that as I think the terms was, they'd been peer reviewed and that you would be willing to testify in a court of law that it was the best science available. Where are we in terms of the projections now?
So the lead modeler on our team is Dr. Tiffany Anderson, and she is in the process of writing up a manuscript to submit our methodology and an example of our results to a leading peer-reviewed journal, scientific journal. So we're hoping for the submission of that within, say, a month, maybe a month and a half. She's been working on it for a month now already. So we're in the process of publishing these results.
And you had mentioned some need for field testing. Has that happened?
So there is sort of a phase 2 or even a phase 3 on these model results. There are some assumptions we made in these that we want to improve on. So we're planning on continuing to produce more model results that have more accuracy by correcting these assumptions over the next 3 years. And we have been asking for funding from various agencies and receiving funding from various agencies. So we're in the process of moving forward on that as well.
Can I just add something to that, Bob? The State Sea Level Rise Report is intended to be a living document. The Climate Act calls for it to be updated every 10 years. That supports the continued development and improvement of the science.
This is a question for Brad. When will the Sea Level Rise Vulnerability and Adaptation Report be available for public review?
It's due to the legislature end of December. Sam Lemo, the commission chair, is saying it's going to be publicly available early January, probably right after the turn of the year.
And there's sort of been a change in the format. We had the interagency group. It's been replaced
by a new group. Can you explain what that is and what that implies for the process going forward?
Yeah, right. So it's been now it's a commission. The new act replaces the previous Act 83. The description of the members of the commission are the same as were on the committee. There is an event happening in next month in October where the commission will be coming together for the first time. They've been given a large task now to focus on greenhouse gas emissions and mitigation as well, in addition to adaptation. And exactly how the commission will be funded, I think, or will fund it also, but I meant to say, will function. It's kind of to be seen. So that meeting will be, there's invitees to it, but I believe it's open to the public, so more to come on that.
Thank you. This is a question for Chip. How accurate is the shoreline area's elevations? How are they determined? Is data available?
So the elevations are everything in this modeling, and they are determined using LiDAR, a laser from an airplane, and it was collected by the U.S. Army Corps of Engineers in 2013. And you use this data to build a digital elevation model, and those DEMs are available. NOAA, in fact, serves DEMs for the whole nation. So Coastal Services Center, are they still called that? I think they are. In Charleston, South Carolina. But if you go on NOAA and ask, just sort of search, you'll find those. They're all available. And the vertical resolution is on the order of a few centimeters, and the footprint is on the order of a couple of decimeters. Very accurate.
This is a question for Brad. What's been the response from homeowners in the affected zones? Is the response different between homeowners of different socioeconomic status?
So I mentioned we've been doing outreach, public and agency meetings around the islands. Honestly, frankly, quite nervous going into a lot of these meetings that we would have some severe backlash when folks saw their communities, potentially underwater in 50 or 100 years or even less. Relieved to say we haven't gotten that at these meetings. Maybe they're kind of hanging out and waiting until the report drops. I'm not sure, but so far the response has been supportive. Folks really kind of understanding this is a real problem that we need to deal with. I really have noticed in my short time in this job a real leap in the acceptance of the science, that this is real, this is happening, we can't hide from this anymore. We're, with this report, really just trying to provide information, enable the community to better plan for this, and I think folks are recognizing that. But, we still have a few more months to go on this report, and we'll see when it gets in legislators' hands at the end of the year, but I'm guardedly optimistic.
This is a question addressed to the whole panel. It's what policies or laws do you think we need to change to address climate change in Hawaii?
Well, as I mentioned, the state sea level rise report will have a range of recommendations in there. 40-some, I think, in the current draft. The first one that comes to mind is our Coastal Zone Management Act. Needs to be looked at. I think environmental review policy, environmental assessments, environmental impact statements need to consider sea level rise. I'll leave it there. Chip, you have any other suggestions?
Yeah, there's a lot more to climate change in Hawaii than just sea level rise. We're looking at heat waves, changes and probably reductions in rainfall. There's been over a century of long-term decreasing rainfall in Hawaii. An increase in extreme rainfall, such that when it rains really hard for a short period of time. All the models are pointing to stronger and more frequent El Niños, And if you think back to 2015, 2016, we had very strong coral bleaching. We had record-setting hurricanes, 15 hurricanes, beat the previous record, which was 11. We had 11 days of record-setting rainfall. We had 24 days of record-setting heat. We had 9 months of drought. El Niños are an exclamation point on climate change, and we're going to see more of these strong El Niños. Now they end, but they do a lot of damage while they're here. And getting back to the coastal zone, if we want beaches in the future, we need to move swiftly, because as I showed you in our modeling, with only 1 foot of sea level rise, we lose large tracts of beach. So we need to move swiftly to develop an exit strategy for assets that are poised on the edge of the beach.
This is a question I believe addressed to Chip. Sea level rise and global warming is such an unknown phenomenon with such a long, very long potential impacts that will not even affect the next generation. Why is it so important to study it now? Can it wait 30 to 50 years? It's a waste of time and resources to me. Even when we learn or confirm if properties will be affected, will the state be ready to compensate those landowners to retreat? If not, how will the plan be implemented?
I hope you're right. I hope that I am wrong. I hope that this plays out not in our lifetimes, nor even in your lifetime, but the vast majority of scientists in the world say that you're wrong and that I'm right. This isn't my modeling that I'm sitting on. It's the modeling of the scientific community around the world. Sea level rise is accelerating. The melting of these ice sheets is accelerating. This is just indisputable observational fact. And I thought you were going to say from the beginning of your question that sea level rise is not just going to end at the end of this century, but is going to go on. And in fact, it is. It's going to go on for over 1,000 years, the models are indicating, because the ice in the world and the oceans are very much out of equilibrium with the heat that we have stored in the atmosphere. If I put an ice cube right here, it's not going to melt like that, and Greenland is not melting like that. An ice cube the size of Greenland takes centuries to come into equilibrium with the temperature of the air, and Antarctica likewise. So this is a long-term problem that's here to stay, and we can deny it, but the longer we deny it, the longer we refuse to act on it, the more expensive and more painful and dangerous it's going to be when we finally decide, oh, I was wrong. Let's move on this.
I'd like to add to that too, that this is not just something for the next generation or the generation after that. We're experiencing these effects of sea level rise in particular now. The office I work with, Conservation Coastal Lands, the county planning departments are inundated, pun intended, with erosion issues, coastal flooding issues recently with the king tides. Both of those due in part to sea level rise that we're experiencing now and have been experiencing for recent decades. So we have problems we need to address that are directly related to this now. We can't push it off. It's happening.
This will be the last question for this segment, and then we'll go to Josh's presentation. Given the reality of recent storms described as 100-year and even 1,000-year storms, do you think 10-year updates to the climate adaptation report will be sufficient? Will there be more frequent updates?
So that question was me? Yeah. Lost some thought there. Can you repeat that, Bob? Yeah.
Sure.
Yeah.
Given the reality of recent storms described as 100-year or even 1,000-year storms, do you think 10-year updates to the report will be sufficient? Will there be more frequent updates?
There intended to be 5-year updates. It's going to depend on funding. Like the next update's not funded yet. It's just in the statute. So it's going to need continued funding. And this commission it got a position with it to coordinate the commission, but there's no funding directly in there yet for updates. So need continued pressure at the legislature and the counties to help with that.
Thank you. And now we'll hear from Josh Stantbro, our Chief Resilience Officer.
Can everybody stand up and stretch for a second so that the post-lunch blood can move a little bit?
I'm gonna get a cup of coffee. You want coffee? No, I'm good. I'm gonna get some coffee.
Yeah, you bet. All right, thank you. So, aloha, everyone. Following the 2 PhDs, I'll try to bring it down a notch to a JD level and hopefully sort of talk on a different level. And I first want to start out with, as planners in the room, I mean, I think everybody's been watching what's been happening with Puerto Rico. And I think it would be good to just send some island thoughts their way because, you know, I think today kind of marks a new era and a new reality for us as islands. As Chief Resilience Officer here in Honolulu, I'm part of a network of 100 cities with the Rockefeller Foundation that I'll talk about here in the slideshow. San Juan, Puerto Rico is one of the cities that they selected, and Alejandra Castro is the CRO there, and she came in before I did and had been working on a project to prevent flooding and runoff in a low-income neighborhood in San Juan that had no stormwater, infrastructure at all. And I just, for the last 24 hours, I've just been thinking, what does that place look like right now? Because you look at, the rest of the city where there actually was infrastructure, and her whole project was around the resilience of this neighborhood that was tested too soon. So I think, as we approach this and we think about what the realities are, I think about Mayor's message this morning about how do we hang on to our island values with, demographics changing. I think the challenge for you all in the room as planners is how do we hang on to our island values as we get pushed and strained in different directions, whether it's storm impacts from climate change, whether it's this issue around how do we find ways to retreat from a shoreline and work out solutions with impassioned landowners and families that have been rooted in these places, cultural practices that have gone on for centuries in these areas, and sort of navigate how are we compassionate around the planning and the execution of these policies that really keep us bound together as a community as we face these things, because it's going to be a challenge. I mean, I think we're up to it. I think we're in better shape here than in many places in the globe, which is why I continue to love living and working in Hawaii. So what is this thing called resilience that everybody's talking about, the new buzzword? The way that Rockefeller defines it is, this capacity of individuals and communities to essentially survive, adapt, and grow no matter what kind of stresses they face in the 21st century, these shocks and stresses that we're talking about. And I think if you think about this as an individual, it makes sense, right? So the most resilient kids in school tend to sort of fight through obstacles, tend to not take no for an answer. When you think about sort of Darwinism, this theory that you don't have to be the strongest, you just have to be the most adaptable. I mean, this is what it's getting at, right? How nimble can we be in the face of change as change is happening all around us? So as I mentioned, there's 100 cities around the globe that were selected by Rockefeller, and we should be really proud here in Honolulu that we were selected. There's 1,200 applicants in terms of cities, and Honolulu was in the third round, and we applied 3 times. So we have grit and resilience just starting out, because they told us no twice, and we said, you really want us? We're going to apply again, and we got in. And I think part of that was enough people had talked to Rockefeller at that point about what Honolulu and Hawaii have to offer the rest of the network. And I think they recognize that there's some really special things that happen here that can help. But this is what Rockefeller is, what drove them to invest $170 million over the last 5 years into these 100 cities. In 1800, 10% of the world's population lived in cities. Today, 54% of the world's population lives in cities, and by 2050, it's expected that 3/4 of the entire globe is going to live in an urbanized environment. So their bet on the cusp of the turn of the century, as they turned 100 years old, and they saw what was coming down the pipeline with climate change, is that these cities are going to have to adapt and get smarter and get resilient to climate change as quickly as possible if we're going to protect essentially 3/4 of the world's population. The other interesting thing about that 75% number is by 2050, 75% of the infrastructure that we'll be living in 2050 has yet to be built across the globe. So if we actually change our budgeting, we change our planning, we change our decisions now, that means that 3/4 of the infrastructure that we'll be surrounded by when this sea level rise hits can be new, and it can be designed for that particular new reality that we face. So it's not like we're completely sunk in terms of what's out there. So this is what Rockefeller does for those that aren't familiar with the 100RC program. It essentially supports a position, which is my position, the Chief Resilience Officer in the mayor's cabinet at these cities, 100 around the globe. Their whole aim is to create a resilience strategy for that city. They do that by both providing some technical assistance through partners that they've assigned to each city. Our partner is AECOM. I think Jeff is here in the audience from AECOM, who's our partner that we work with. And so they provide assistance to the city to essentially get this resilience strategy done. They also provide, which is really unique and innovative, they have MOUs with about 200 different for-profit academic and nonprofit institutions around the globe that are willing to provide pro bono services to the city departments that are implementing resilience projects. So to the extent that we can justify it to the Rockefeller folks, here we want to work on this project to make us more resilient, can you provide a link with Siemens or Veolia or Microsoft to help make that happen? We can tap that, which is really exciting. So what I was asked to talk about today is how do we get this resilience strategy put together, and as planners, I'm sure you're keen to hear how the plan will be put together. Essentially, this process over the next year is going to be identifying where our vulnerabilities are, where our weaknesses are, and then it's not a plan, it's a strategy, it's an action strategy. So it actually will identify what are the actual projects, the actual policies that should be put into place to make the city and county more resilient. And at the same time, hopefully through that process, we've done some education, we've also done some networking, and people are more invested and bought in to this idea that resilience does pay a dividend. The whole point of the resilience strategy was based on a book by Judy Rodin, who is the head of Rockefeller Foundation, that said if you do design around resilient principles, you'll actually end up saving a ton of money on the back end, as well as getting other social benefits. So if you need you're going to armor a shoreline. If you can build it in the right way with the resilient principles and turn it into a bike path, you can have some social benefits, for instance, but while also saving money down the road if you design it the right way. So this is the overall process. Essentially, and that's pretty small, so I'll just tell you, there's now through the first quarter of next year, we're going to be going out, talking to people, getting their ideas, talking to stakeholders, going out to neighborhood boards. And then in the last 3 quarters of next year, we'll be working with AECOM and other platform providers to essentially do a deep dive into a few key areas, so 3 to 5 key areas that we think have the most potential for the city and county of Honolulu. Each city gets to determine what their key vulnerabilities are, what would make them more resilient. And so it is not a cookie cutter sort of approach. Each city is actually working on totally different vulnerabilities to make them more resilient. So the first step in this process, which I'm actually going to guinea pig on you guys hopefully today if the technology works, is developing what is, and it is so crazy small. It's a perceptions assessment. So essentially not what's the objective realities out there around the consensus around our vulnerabilities. It's what do people think are our vulnerabilities, and are we addressing them as a city? So to do that, I would like you all, this is the only presentation ever where I'm going to ask you to take out your phones and turn them on. So please do take out your phones, turn them on. go to www.menti, M-E-I, or MENTI.com.
Can you say it again?
MENTI.com. You guys there?
Yep.
And if you're there, go ahead and enter the code 362050. So 362050. So I'm cheating because they asked me to come here to tell you stuff, but I'm actually going to mine all of the brains in the room, and you're going to tell me stuff. Tell me what to do for the next 2 years. You guys all in? Okay. Let me navigate this thing. Okay. So you should be seeing that on your screens now, right? Everybody seeing this? Okay, so that's the quick, this is what we're doing, but since I'm here, we can just move. So first thing we want to know is we want to make sure that we're getting spread out around the island, perceptions from all over the island. So we're going to keep track of all this. This is all going into a database. Put in your zip code where you live. And if you're from neighbor islands, go ahead, put your zip code in. But I would like you to think about doing this survey with your perceptions about Oahu's weaknesses and vulnerabilities. Oh my God, are you kidding? Okay. Everybody in? Okay, so next, choose which sector you work with. We better have a lot of government folks in the room, I would think. Not the one you want to work in, the one that you actually work in now. All in? Okay. And then just quickly type in whatever organization that you are associated with. And you can do it shorthand. So if it's you work for the state, just say state. Doesn't have to be fancy. 362050. 362050. Okay, so what was that? Let's say 52, 54. How many people we got in the room? We'll cut it off at 60. Oh, there's a stall. 57. There's 57 people. 58. Okay. So, in your gut, after hearing that earlier definition of resiliency, tell us how resilient you think Oahu is today. Just pick on a scale of 1 to 10. You can see the optimists, and now the pessimists are catching up. It's a horse race. Nobody thinks that we're ready for anything? Come on. Hey. This is like scoring gymnastics, though. We're going to throw out the top and the bottom one. Make sure there's nobody juicing the score, the boosters out there. Okay, 55. Everybody, let's call it. Okay, so please take a scroll through the drop down and you pick what you think is your top 3 shocks that we're vulnerable to.
You don't have sea level rise.
It's under climate change impacts, isn't it? Oh, not shock. Shock. It's not a shock. Oh yeah. So good question. Chip says, "Where's my sea level rise?" Shocks are actually things that happen like that. So it's a hurricane. It's a disease comes through. It's a forest fire. Stresses, which we will get to in a minute, are the slow-moving kind of onset stuff. So you'll get your chance, Chip. No, this is what keeps you up at night. So what you think we are most vulnerable to. What's that? You couldn't hear? Oh, okay. So right now, hurricane is at 78%, tsunami is at 56%, and external economic crisis and infrastructure failure are tied for third. And we're at 57, so 58, 59. Okay, so it looks like hurricane and tsunami are the most feared shocks, which makes sense for an island. Okay, so remember what you just put in as your top fear for a shock, and now type in what you think the most important thing is we can do to withstand that, or what's the most important thing we will do that will allow us to address that. So this could be, it could be a soft thing, like it could be community cohesion. If you know your neighbor. It could be a hard thing. It could be like we should build more break walls. It could be, it can be anything. It could be a policy. It's just what you think is the key to being ready for this type of thing.
Do the colored boxes mean anything?
No, so these are all the rolling as they come in, and they just separate them with a color box so that you'll see the difference, but they're all, yeah, someone put my favorite, upgrade building codes. We're on it, we're on it.
You don't need to prepare talks anymore, do you? You just do this.
So this is gonna be a part of the next 4 months.
Pretty nice.
Yeah. And thank you for we literally have not done this. We put this survey together earlier this week and kick tested this Menti thing, and it's actually working pretty well. So this is all going to dump into a database that's going to inform like what we actually work on. Okay. Everybody pretty much got in something? Okay. Okay, so now remember what you just put in and tell us how well are we doing right now on that issue. So if you put in update building codes, it's clear that you don't think we're quite doing as well. It's an area of strength because you would like them updated, so you need to do better. This looks like my paper when I used to hand it in to teachers in school. There's a lot of red on it. That's too bad. Okay. So now we're going to do the exact same thing, but we're going to do it for stresses. So again, name the top 3 stresses that you think really threaten our quality of life existence on Oahu. And this is where Chip gets to put in sea level rise under climate change impacts, I think. And we're going to do the exact same thing. So you remember what you put in here, and then what's the best way to address it, and how are we doing on it? See, the smart people are realizing if they get them in early, they get to like completely juice the results because it's a 100% of one person says that. So right now, since you can't see, climate change is the big yellow one on the left. That's 60%. Cost of living and aging infrastructure are second and third right next to it. And then lack of affordable housing, which is obviously key. So Rockefeller takes a very broad view about resilience. And so we're actually trying to, poll folks around all the different issues that the island faces. And whether it's our office that leads those or not, we can actually bring resources into other city departments to try to address them. Okay. Okay, so again, oh shoot, sorry, wait, let me go back. Okay, so go ahead and type in what's the most important thing that will determine how well we do in facing the stress that you just articulated. And for anyone who's sort of a polling geek or a constructive criticism type person, since this is the first time we're ever running it, if you want to come up and talk to me after and say, you know, you should change order or you should change words, I don't understand something, I will be all ears, because we're going to be trying to use this at neighborhood boards at different places, and so we'd really be interested in hearing how we can improve this as we go forward. Yeah, aloha. I'll see if Rockefeller can fund political revolution, but I assume that they're going to have a issue with that one. I think Aloha is winning this one. I've seen 3 or 4 flash past. More Aloha, which is awesome. Okay, we're getting close. Anybody? Got 44, so pretty much everybody weighed in. Okay, so remember what you just typed in. For all those people that said more Aloha, tell us, is that an area of strength for Hawaii in comparison to other places? Could we do a little bit better? All right, 60. You guys are fast on you're getting faster. Okay, and this is my favorite question, and one of the ones that Rockefeller has used just recently. So what are you most proud of that Oahu or Hawaii, for this crowd since you guys are from elsewhere as well, what are you most proud of that's happening that you think improves our resilience? And for you naysayers, there are things out there. We, with a group that we did in June, Hokulea was the Malama Honua voyage was like top notch. People have that. Ooh, yeah, whoever voted for the Office of Climate Change, Resiliency, and Sustainability, see you in the bar at 5, I'm buying, thank you. Someone said that we're even talking about it, which, given what the state is on the continent, and the fact that an Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency just passed here by an almost 20-point margin, sometimes we truly are lucky we live Hawaii. And for the person who said stockpiling food and medicine, I'm coming over to your house when the big one hits, so. Okay. Okay, so here is where you name an activity that your organization or an organization that you're fond of is an activity that they're doing, currently doing, or is about to launch that's going to address resilience issues on the island. And what this is for, to give you a little background, is we're basically trying to build an index of all the different resiliency activity happening on the island so that we don't miss anything going on. So if you have something that you know of that you think is building resilience on this island, that a nonprofit is doing, that a for-profit is doing, that your organization is doing, just type it in. Even if it's not on Oahu, we don't mind. So I don't know are you guys able to see those over there, or is it too small? Can you see them? Oh, you can't? Okay. So this is number one is to have a screen big enough that the entire room can see it. Because the whole point is you're supposed to be seeing the things going up and seeing where you intersect with other folks. Okay, so we're almost to 50. We can move on here. And this is where you get to wave your magic wand and essentially say, given all that we know about sort of our risk and vulnerability, what's the one action that you wish Oahu would take, regardless of practicality? I don't care whether it has a chance in happening or not, but what's the one action that you wish we would take immediately to make us more resilient as a community? So right in the first three, there was managed retreat and move infrastructure inland. So I think this is a juiced crowd. You guys. Move rail path inland. I'll tell Mayor about that when I go back to the office. Appreciate that one. Thank you. This is actually my favorite question, along with the proud one, because I feel like it lets us dream a little bit. Oh, then somebody else says, build rail, hurry up. Thanks. Yeah, okay. Working on it. Okay. 49, everybody got theirs in? Okay. Okay, and here, this is where we're trying to make sure that the map we have of organizations that are working on resiliency issues, if there's somebody you think we should go talk to as we build the resilience strategy and have them help inform the things that the city should be working on, please just type in the name of the organization. So where we get the most hits around, an organization name, we'll make sure that we go to those guys first and don't miss anybody that can help inform the strategy. And for whoever put in Trump, I think we're not gonna try to call attention to what we're doing out here. So I'm gonna let that's gonna be the last on my list. And for whoever put the community, everyone, do you do this for a living? Is this how easy is that to go do? Okay. Everybody get a chance to put in their favorite? Okay, so we're getting to the end. If you would like to be kept up to date on the resilience strategy as it gets built out, the office, we're gonna have a newsletter for the Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency Office. If you're interested in hearing about what we're up to and how this is developing, put in your email address. Oh, how do I, I'm supposed to not. How do I not hide this? Yeah, I'm not supposed to do that. Where's the projector? I don't know why it's not showing, but that's awesome. So what we'll do, we're not going to take your names, but we'll have the email address. It'll be in our database, and we'll send you out stuff. And if you ever want to get taken off it, all you got to do is reply and say, thanks, I'm done. Okay. What's that?
I'm done with your resiliency.
Yeah. Who needs resiliency anyway, right? All right, still ticking up. A couple people. And we'll move on to the last couple questions. So this we're doing just to make sure that we're hitting all the different people around the island, different age groups, different communities. So please put in your age really quickly. And these just track to the census blocks. You know there's got to be somebody under 18 in the room, no? There's no planners under 18? Maybe that's part of our problem in the state. Okay. And then another question that we're asking is, you know that the demographics just shifted, right? So we just went from majority of folks born in Hawaii who are residents, and now it's like 52% the other way, guys like me who came from Northern California and elsewhere. So we're trying to make sure that we're getting the right mix in when we're meeting with folks. So please enter whether you your birthplace is in Hawaii or outside of Hawaii.
Want me to move that paper?
Huh? Oh yeah, you want to see this? Yeah. So what's that? Yeah, yeah. And this doesn't count my parents who actually sailed here, so I don't know what they would have done. They didn't fly here, so. Okay. So, and the last one is how do you identify ethnicity so that we can make sure that we're not just talking to the same people over and over and over. That's my last one. We're at 46, so a few more. So we can see we probably have a little work to do to diversify our planners movement, or at least the panel. Huh?
Some questions?
Right, so if... Yeah, so the question was, it doesn't allow someone to do more than one, which is a common question to the U.S. Census as well. There is a one on here that says HAPA, or multiracial. So if you're a mix of more than one, if you put... Ooh, I'm going to talk... Let's talk afterwards then, so we can get it right. Okay. Okay. Everybody in? Okay, so thank you for being guinea pigs on this endeavor. We're going to be doing this over the next 4 months or so in all kinds of different settings, trying to ask the same questions and trying to see what rises to the surface, because really through this process, we're going to design a resilient strategy based exactly on what people tell us it should be designed around. Like I say, obviously the Office of Climate Change, Sustainability, and Resiliency will be in charge of certain pieces, but if affordable housing winds up our number one thing, then what we'll wind up doing is we'll work in partnership with the department, the housing department, and other departments to try to bring resources from Rockefeller to help address that issue, because it clearly is one that sort of tears at the fiber of our society. So I think I used up more than my time. Thank you so much for your patience on doing that, and I look forward to talking to you afterwards.
We do have a short amount of time for
You guys are PhDs.
questions. Same drill. If our helpers can collect any 3x5 cards with questions, these are to Josh, and I'll start out with the question. It's been said that the level of trust in the community is critical to resilience. What is it critical to do to ensure that Honolulu has that level of trust?
So we actually start out from a place of strength, I think. When we ran a quick workshop in June, there was about 150 decision makers there, and the thing that elevated as the strongest element for our city was social cohesion. That is not the case in most of the cities where the Rockefeller folks are working. So I think that whether you call it trust, whether you call it know your neighbor, whether you call it aloha spirit, we're actually starting, I think, from a place, even though it may not feel like it because it's coming down over time potentially here, we're starting from a higher place than a lot of other communities are at. And I think, honestly, the other thing that will help hopefully build it is going out to do the community presentations in the way that we're trying to do and pilot with you guys here, in terms of getting people to actually tell us what they think, and then basing our research around the things that people give us the input, as opposed to just trying to go into a research mode and figure it out ourselves.
Are you coordinating to ensure you're not duplicating efforts? For example, the sea level rise report?
Yes, so as Brad said, the report that's coming out is just a report, not a climate adaptation plan. Our intention, we put in a grant to Partners for Places, which is a national foundation, to develop a climate adaptation and mitigation plan for Oahu through the office, through the Office of Climate Change. If we get awarded that grant, which we hope we will, next year, 2018, at the same time we're doing the resilience strategy, a subcomponent of that would be a climate adaptation and mitigation plan. So we're trying to take the report that they're pulling together and leverage it to take that information and then develop a plan that would address what the policy considerations are, what the projects are that can help address it. And I think there's actually, as Brad said, there's some, over the last year, I think there's been an uptick in people's genuine concern, and I think people are scared about what this poses for us, and that's helped bring some cohesion to the field. I've seen more collaboration between the counties, between the sustainability coordinators, and between the different departments than I had before. This is my first time in government. I've worked in the nonprofit sector before, so I'm coming in on a different sort of time scale, but it feels like people are together and trying to collaborate and align rather than duplicate.
Are you planning on integrating this resiliency strategy by revising the general plan, development plans, sustainable community plans for Oahu?
Kathy? Yeah, so when does it come back? In 4 years? We go to every island, right? So maybe in 4 years when you come back, that it will be being incorporated. I mean, I think the resilience plan the resilience strategy is really meant to target like tangible things that can and should be done. So it can make recommendations to incorporate like that. We're obviously on different timelines. Everything happens in 5-year increments, 10-year increments. The reality is, I think, and all of us begin to realize in the room, within a few years, this issue is going to be front and center for almost every department working. And so I think it's going to get integrated into people's work just because of the necessity and the sort of multifaceted nature of what we're up against with climate adaptation. So I have confidence that, yes, those plans will reflect it. And I think they already do. Kathy, you guys have already incorporated climate on the last couple, right, that you did? Yeah.
We're going to do more for the primary. We're going to do more for the primary urban centers. What she said. We had an existential crisis here. We can either run Chip Fletcher's movie or pose 2 more questions, and I'm choosing the moderator's criteria that we'll do what I like.
Humanity is very fortunate. Our home, planet Earth, has been swinging in and out of ice ages and warm periods over the past 1,000,000 years. And it's only the past 12,000 years, when we left the last ice age, that we enter a unique equilibrium of planet Earth, the Holocene, that has enabled the world to develop as we know it. It's not too cold and not too warm. In fact, it's staying within the narrow band of a maximum temperature variability of ±1 degree Celsius. And the drama is that now we have so much scientific evidence that we're pushing humanity out of this Goldilocks equilibrium. This is a crisis where we can no longer exclude risks of catastrophic tipping points. We've shifted over from being this small world on a big planet to today being a big world on a small planet. We know that we are facing at least 1 meter sea level rise this century, that heat waves and droughts and floods are critical threats that will occur, which in turn risks stability in societies that can tip over into refugee crises across the world. We need to bend the curve of emissions no later than 2020 to stand a chance to surf down an incredibly steep slope of reducing emissions and leading to a decarbonized world economy by mid-century. But the good news is we're starting to see the first indications that the exponential rise of emissions is starting to level off. We're starting to see that renewable energy systems are entering the rapid phase of exponential adoption in the world. We can see that delivering on Paris, bending the curve, can go from a necessity to also being something that is doable. Now, all of this translates into a global carbon law. For us to succeed with a decarbonized, desired future for humanity, we need to halve emissions every decade. And this halving emissions every decade becomes a golden rule which is applicable at any scale, as an individual or a household or a company or nation, which then needs to add up to the world as a whole. This is the golden rule that can enable us to stay in the Goldilocks equilibrium. It is what gives us a chance to succeed in transforming to a stable and resilient planet that can support the development of humanity on Earth.
I'd like you to join me in thanking this wonderful panel.